Hello and welcome to my Glaive guide. The Glaive is considered to be one of the worst weapons in-game by many players, and although I agree that the Glaive is rather hard to use, I also noticed that most players use the Glaive in the wrong way, so I decided to make this guide in order to help you perform well with the Glaive on the battlefield. The Glaive can be used by the Footman and also by the Vanguard and is extremely fast while also having a really good attack range, but the weapon's biggest flaw is its damage. So let us take a look at the damage value of the Glaive first before we go into the 5 most important tips. Since the weapon type of the Glaive is chop, you will deal 17.5% bonus damage against Footmen and 25% bonus damage against knights. In this table you can see the damage values you will deal when hitting the different classes with certain types of attacks. Feel free to pause at this point and look at the values, but let me sum up the most important things to note here. The Glaive deals really low damage overall, but your heavy stabs and your heavy overhead attacks can hurt quite a bit. Also, your special and sprint attacks are not too bad damage wise. And one more thing to keep in mind is that the damage of your light overhead attack is actually pretty good considering the insane speed of your overhead attacks. Many players who want to use the Glaive ask themselves whether they should play as Raider, which is a subclass of the Vanguard, or as Poleman, which is a subclass of the Footman. Both subclasses have their advantages and disadvantages. A big advantage of the Raider, for example, is that he can use 2 main weapons and he also has the Warhorn as special ability. The impact you can have on the game using the Warhorn is way bigger than the impact you can have using the bandage kits which the Poleman has. And it will also show in terms of your score, because most of the times you will rack up way more score points using the Warhorn than using bandage kits. But overall, bandage kits are more reliable because sometimes when you use your Warhorn, you won't get a single point and you won't heal anybody because a teammate used his Warhorn right before you. And the next big difference to keep in mind is that the Footman and the Vanguard have different sprint attacks. The Vanguard leaps when performing a sprint attack and the Footman will charge when performing a sprint attack. And overall, the sprint attack of the Footman is better because it is more reliable and deals more damage. And the last significant difference between the two subclasses is that the Vanguard has 20 more stamina, but the Footman has 20 more HP. But oftentimes you won't notice this extra HP because there are a lot of weapons which deal bonus damage to Footman. So overall, both subclasses have their advantages and disadvantages, but I personally would recommend playing as Raider because the Warhorn has so much potential and having 2 main weapons is also extremely nice. Alright, now let's get to tip number 2. Spam overhead attacks in most cases. If you want to perform really well with the Glaive, you have to utilize the insanely fast overhead attacks which you have. And although the damage of your overhead attacks is not that good in comparison to other weapons, your attack speed will definitely make up for it. When spamming your overhead attacks, try to stay at the edges of the fight. Because if you do this, you will have less of a chance to hit a teammate of you, which will also make your attack stop, and you have more of a chance to hit multiple enemies at once. And in this following comparison to the Messer, you can see how fast the overhead actually is. And yes, the speed is just insane. But there are some cases where you don't want to use overhead attacks, for example like in this case. Whenever there is a chance that a teammate might run in front of you, which would result in your overhead attack being stopped, it is better to use a stab, because a stab will always go through and not stop if you would hit your teammate. And you also don't want to spam overhead attacks when you could potentially hit multiple enemies at once with a horizontal strike. And whenever you notice that your enemy counters your overhead attacks, you should definitely switch it up. In the following example, I will use a delayed heavy overhead attack and also drag it into my opponent to get around his block. So as you have seen, there are some cases where you don't want to spam overhead attacks, but in most cases you definitely want to. Because the wind up time of your overhead attacks is just too good. And now let's get to the third tip. Dash and crouch to keep your distance. Since the attack range of the Glaive is so good, you will be able to hit your enemies while they will be not able to hit you in many cases if you keep your distance. And the best way to keep your distance is to dash a lot and also to crouch while attacking. Because whenever you move backwards while striking, you will make a small step forward. But if you crouch while doing that, you will just stop and not make that step forward. And now let's get to tip number 4. If you have decided to play as a footman, you should definitely utilize your sprint attack a lot. Your sprint attack is a good tool to start or join a fight, and you will also deal a good amount of damage. And the last tip, tip number 5. Sprint attack kills as Vanguard will charge your special ability really fast. And since you can have a big impact on the game with your Warhorn, you should definitely try to get a couple sprint attack kills. Alright, that's it for my Glaive guide. I hope you enjoyed it. If yes, please subscribe, it would really help me out. And also like the video if it was useful for you. And as always, see you on the battlefield.